You asked the right people. That was all he said. Their words, a man the entire town feared, a girl nobody had stopped for. Cars kept moving. Dozens of people had walked past her in the rain and not one of them turned around. A 23-year-old woman with a broken brace and a slipping cane cried out for help at a busy intersection. It wasn't a neighbor who answered. It wasn't a police officer, and even a stranger with a kind face. It was the Hells Angels. And nothing in Silver Creek would ever be the same again. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single part of this matters. The rain came down hard that Tuesday morning. It's not the soft, polite kind of rain that makes people pull their coats a little tighter and keep moving. This was the kind of rain that soaks through a jacket in 30 seconds and that fills sidewalk cracks and turns them into small rivers, and that makes every uneven surface twice as dangerous for someone who already has to think about every step she takes. Parker had been standing at the corner of Maple and 5th for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. She knew the exact time because she had been counting. It was something Emily did when the panic started to rise, when her body stopped cooperating, and her mind had to take over. Seconds, she counted cracks in the pavement. Third, she counted the number of people who walked past her without making eye contact. It was something her physical therapist had suggested 3 years earlier, something that kept her grounded when the world felt like it was tilting sideways. Right now, the count was at 277 seconds. Chubby had stopped. Her silver walking brace, the custom-fitted, one that had taken 6 months and 2 insurance appeals to finally get approved, had locked up somewhere between the bookstore parking lot and the crosswalk. It happened sometimes. The mechanism that allowed her knee to flex at the correct angle would catch, especially in cold conditions. It didn't just slow her down, it stopped her completely. A gear jamming mid-rotation, like a door that simply refuses to open no matter how hard you push. She'd been standing at that intersection like a statue. Left leg rigid at the knee, her aluminum cane jammed at an angle between 2 raised sections of cracked sidewalk, pedestrian signals cycling through, red and green and red again, like it had no idea she existed. To most of the people rushing past her, she didn't. A man in a business suit so close, his briefcase nearly knocked her shoulder. He didn't look up from his phone. A woman pushing a stroller crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Emily struggling, as though difficulty were contagious. A teenage boy slowed down for exactly 1 second, glanced at her brace, and then sped up again like he'd thought better of getting involved. Emily had lived 23 years in Silver Creek, Virginia. She knew this intersection. She knew the smell of this rain, a particular way the signal beeped twice before changing, way the wet leaves from the oak trees on 5th Street always piled against the curb in October. She had navigated this corner hundreds of times, but she had never been stuck like this, not in public, alone, not with her cane at the wrong angle, and her brace locked solid, and the whole mechanical system of her body refusing to cooperate, not like this, there with people streaming past her like water around a stone. Tried to shift her weight. Bad idea. The cane slipped another half-inch deeper into the crack. She felt the familiar burn, starting in her lower back, the one that came when she held one position too long, when her muscles started compensating for what the brace was supposed to be doing. She'd been through enough physical therapy to know that she had maybe another 3 minutes before that burn turned into something sharper and less manageable. A breath. She looked across the street, and that was when she saw them. All right, owners. She had known about the Hells Angels chapter in Silver Creek the same way everyone in town knew about them, through whispers, through warnings, through the particular silence that fell over a diner when one of them walked in to get coffee. The house was right there on 5th Street, a squat brick building with blacked out windows and a row of motorcycles parked out front that stretched halfway down the block. People crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk past that building. Parents told their children not to stare. There were maybe 12 of them out front right now, gathered under the overhang, a few of them smoking, several of them talking, all of them wearing the leather vests with the winged skull patch across the back that had been making Silver Creek residents uncomfortable for the better part of 2 decades. About big men, loud laughter, the particular kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. Emily stared at them for a long moment. Then she looked at the empty sidewalk on her side of the street. Honors. Then she looked at the signal which had just turned red again. About her options. She could wait for, on her side of the street to stop, but it had been 4 minutes and 37 seconds, and that hadn't happened yet. And her back was now firmly in the burning stage. Free the cane. She could try to free the cane herself, but the last time she'd done that without support, gone down sideways onto concrete and spent a week recovering from a bruised hip. But her mother was 40 minutes away and working a double shift at the nursing home and had already missed 2 shifts this month because of Emily-related emergencies, and Emily could not be the reason for a third, or she could ask the Hells Angels for help. That would have seemed absurd to her an hour ago. It still seems somewhat absurd now, but absurdity has a way of becoming irrelevant when your back is on fire and your cane is stuck and you're counting seconds in the rain. She drew in a breath that was steadier than she felt. She raised her voice. "Excuse me, can someone help me?" The words came out smaller than she intended. The rain swallowed most of them. A truck rumbled past and took the rest. It again louder this time, putting her throat into it the way her choir teacher had taught her in 7th grade. "Before the accident, fill your lungs first." Just from the diaphragm, "Excuse me, can someone help me?" Yes. The last word cracked slightly. She hadn't meant for that. So she hadn't meant to let the please come out sounding like what it actually was. A polite social nicety, but a genuine, unguarded plea from someone who had run out of options and was trying very hard not to show it, but came out that way anyway. And across the street, the overhang of the Hells Angels clubhouse, the laughter stopped. The biggest man in the group turned around first. He was not the kind of person who goes unnoticed in any context. Even across a rain-soaked 4-lane intersection, with water streaming down the plate glass windows of the hardware store behind him and the visual noise of a busy street between them, he was the kind of person your eyes went to automatically. Not because he was threatening, though he was large, and he was weathered. And there was something in the way he stood that suggested he had been in situations that required significant personal fortitude. Something else, something harder to name. Later, when Emily tried to describe it to her mother, she would say that he looked like someone who had decided a very long time ago exactly who he was and had never questioned it since. His name was Michael Reynolds. Most people called him Hawk. He was 55 years old, a former Marine who had done 2 tours overseas before coming back to Silver Creek with a knee that ached in cold weather and a certainty that civilian life would never quite fit the same way a uniform had. He had been running this chapter of Hells Angels for 11 years. At the time, the club had done more for the struggling neighborhoods of Silver Creek than most people realized toy drives at Christmas. For veterans who couldn't navigate the benefit system, volunteer work after the flooding that wiped out the East Side Trailer Park in 2019. But none of it was publicized. That was deliberate. Hawk did not do things for recognition. He did things because they needed doing. He turned around when he heard Emily's voice the second time. Not the first time. The first time had been too quiet, followed by rain and truck noise and the general indifference of a Tuesday morning. The second time, with that fractured please at the end of it, he heard it, and more importantly, he understood it. Understood it because he had heard that particular sound before, not the words, quality of them. The sound of someone who has held themselves together through considerable effort and has just reached the exact limit of what effort can accomplish. He had heard it from men in combat. He had heard it from his sister after her husband left. He had heard it from his own throat once in a VA hospital bathroom a long time ago when he thought nobody was listening. He knew what it meant. It meant, I am asking because I have already tried everything else. He handed his coffee cup to the man next to him without a word, got off the curb, and walked across the street. Behind him, the other men watched. Nobody followed immediately. That wasn't unusual. Hawk had a way of handling things on his own terms. Others had learned over the years to read the difference between a situation that needed everyone and a situation that needed him alone, at least at first. He walked with a slight favor toward his right leg, the knee, always the knee in October, but his pace was steady and deliberate. He crossed all four lanes without breaking stride, up onto Emily's curb and stopped directly in front of her. He was 6'2", she was 5'5". He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. She noticed his eyes first, dark brown, deep set, framed by lines that came from decades of squinting in bright sun or hard wind. Angry eyes, not cold eyes. Evaluating eyes, the kind that were taking in information rapidly and efficiently, cataloging the situation without judgment. He looked at her face, at her brace. He looked at the cane, saw exactly where it was caught, assessed the angle, assessed her posture, assessed what she'd need. Then he lowered himself, not quickly, because of the knee, without hesitation, onto one knee in the rain, right there on the sidewalk, in his leather vest and his heavy boots. And he put one large hand gently on the cane and the other on the cracked sidewalk edge, and he said, very calmly, very simply, "Listeners, you asked the right people." Emily said nothing. She wasn't capable of speech in that moment. Not because she was afraid, she realized, with some surprise, that she wasn't afraid. She was something else. She was undone. Not by the kindness exactly, but by the matter-of-factness of it. The way he'd crossed a four-lane street in the rain without being asked twice and gotten down on his knee in the wet without grimacing and said those words like they were the most obvious thing in the world. Helping her was not an act of charity or heroism or social performance, but simply the correct response to the situation. It was the only possible answer. He worked the cane out of the crack carefully and efficiently, no yanking, no struggling, just a precise repositioning of the angle and a firm pull. He handed it back to her, handle first, the way you hand someone a tool they know how to use. "Us," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd already seen it. "The knee joint locks sometimes," she said. Her voice was steadier now. I need someone to put light pressure on the outside of my knee while I try to rotate it. It usually releases. It just needs show me where." She guided his hand to the exact spot on the side of the brace. Pressure careful, controlled, not too much, and she rotated her knee slowly. After 2 seconds, the mechanism released with a soft click that she felt more than heard, and suddenly she was standing like a person again instead of a statue. She exhaled so hard it almost became a laugh. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, really." You live around here?" he asked. He wasn't being intrusive. His voice was the voice of someone doing a practical inventory. "Thorn Apartments," she said. "On Birch Street. I work at Morrison's Books." She blinked. "You know it?" "We keep a donation box there," he said, standing up slowly. "For the Veterans Literacy Fund. Old Jack checks it every second Tuesday." He brushed the water off his knee without ceremony. "You walked from there this morning?" "The bus was running 40 minutes late," she said. And then, because the honesty of the situation seemed to demand honesty, always afford a cab. He nodded once, just once. The way a person nods when they've added something to a list in their head and will return to it later. "It's about to change," he said. "You want to get across?" "Yes." Yes. He walked beside her. Not in front of her, behind her, exactly beside her, matching her pace, which was slower than his natural gait, and he didn't rush it. He didn't offer his arm unless she needed it. He didn't hover. He simply walked with her like it was the most natural thing in the world. They were two people who had somewhere to be and were getting there together. But when they reached the other curb, 3 of the other men were waiting. In a crowd, not looming, just there, positioned the way people position themselves when they've quietly decided to be useful without making a production of it. A large man with a round, open face and a beard that had some gray working through it gave her a smile so genuine, it looked slightly out of place. Like a sunflower in a parking lot. I'm Tank, he said. Look, you need a ride somewhere, or you good? Emily looked at him, at Hawk, then at the street she'd just crossed, about the bus that was still 40 minutes late, about the appointment she had in an hour and a half, her monthly check-in with her physical therapist, which she could not miss, because missing it meant rescheduling, and rescheduling meant a 6-week wait, and 6 weeks was a long time when your knee brace was locking up in the rain. I have an appointment, she said slowly. I was going to take the bus. Cover, Tank said. The medical center around 9. Tank looked at Hawk. Hawk said nothing, but something passed between them. Silent calibration. Tank looked back at Emily. I can have you there in 15 minutes, he said. Charge, no strings. He paused. I know how that sounds coming from us. I get it. But I'm just a guy with a truck, and you need to get somewhere. Emily Parker had spent 23 years learning to accept help when it came from forms she recognized her mother, doctors, her professors, the occasional kind stranger who held a door open. She had also spent 23 years developing a finely tuned instinct for the kind of help that came with an invoice attached, kind that was really just obligation dressed in generosity's clothing. At Tank for a long moment, she looked at Hawk, at the rain, which had not stopped. She looked at the time on her phone, which confirmed that the bus, even if it arrived right now, did not get her to the medical center before her appointment window closed. Yes, she said. It was the smallest word. It barely registered above the sound of the rain. But it was the word that changed everything. Her Tank's truck was a dark blue F-250 with a collection of pine tree air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirror and a first aid kit bungee corded to the back of the passenger seat and a small stuffed buffalo sitting on the dashboard that he explained, being asked, had been put there by his 8-year-old niece and was therefore not negotiable. Emily sat in the passenger seat with her brace adjusted and her cane propped against the door and her backpack in her lap and tried to remember the last time a stranger had done something for her that felt entirely uncomplicated. Thought. Does it hurt? Tank asked. He was watching the road. Her. The brace locking? Not exactly. It's more disorienting. Your brain sends the signal to walk and your body says, no. And there's this pause where you have to figure out what to do next. Like your command system goes offline. She looked at him sideways. Exactly like that. I had a buddy, Tank said. Came back from Fallujah with nerve damage in his right hand. Trouble. Said the worst part wasn't the pain. Said the worst part was picking something up and having it just not be there. His hand would open and the thing would be on the floor and he couldn't figure out what happened in between. He was quiet for a moment. He said people always wanted to talk about the pain. Understood that it was the in-between that got to him. Emily said nothing for a second. Exactly it, she said quietly. The in-between. Tank nodded and said nothing else. And somehow that was the right response. He dropped her at the medical center entrance with 10 minutes to spare, helped her navigate the curb without making it into a moment, gave her his phone number written on the back of a gas station seat in case the bus is late again, and drove away. Before she had the chance to figure out how to say thank you properly, she stood at the entrance to the medical center with his number in her hand, about throwing it away. She thought about it for a long time, put it in her coat pocket instead. Emily did not call the number for 9 days. There are reasons, reasonable reasons. She wasn't the kind of person who called strangers, even strangers who had been kind to her. She was the kind of person who handled things independently. A list of contingency plans for when the first plan failed, a backup bus schedule on her phone, and a backup cab service bookmarked in her browser, and a backup emergency contact who was not her mother because her mother had enough to worry about. Also, the kind of person who thought late at night, in the dark, listening to the pipes in the old building make their complicated nocturnal sounds the weight of other people's inconvenience. About how much space she was allowed to take up, whether asking for help was something she had the right to do without having first exhausted every single other option. There is not the physical one, the other one. She saw every other Thursday when she could afford it, called this pattern self-erasure. Well, she'd given Emily a worksheet about it. Emily had filled it out dutifully and then spent 3 weeks doing exactly the same thing anyway. Because knowing what a pattern is called does not automatically give you the power to break it. On that day, the bus didn't come at all. Not late, 40 minutes behind schedule. Not rerouted, just nothing. She stood at the stop for 25 minutes in a coat that wasn't warm enough for October, watching other people get picked up by cars and ride shares and friends with good timing, about the physical therapy appointment she was going to miss, and the 6-week rescheduling penalty, and the medical center's new policy about no show fees. And she reached into her coat pocket and found the gas station receipt with Tank's number on it. Their corners. She stared at it. She dialed before she could think about it long enough to talk herself out of it. First, on the second ring. "Yeah, this is Emily. He's from the intersection on. I know who this is," he said. Unkindly, just matter-of-factly. "Where are you?" She told him. 12 minutes, he said. He was there in 10. This time, Emily noticed more about the truck. The first aid kit was newer than the vehicle itself and stocked more thoroughly than most people stock their home medicine cabinets. There was a laminated card on the visor with emergency contacts, not personal ones, institutional ones, fire department, poison control, VA crisis line. "You keep a first aid kit like that in your regular car?" she asked. "Every vehicle I own," he said. Why, he considered the question seriously. Doc says he started, then stopped. Started again differently. When I was 19, I watched a car accident happen in front of me, and I didn't know what to do. I had nothing. The ambulance took 11 minutes, and I stood there for 11 minutes, completely useless. He glanced at the kit in the rearview mirror. "That's not happening again." Emily looked at him. She had spent a lot of her life being helped by institutions, hospitals, therapy centers, disability services offices, insurance companies, systems, bureaucracies, forms in triplicate. She had rarely been helped by individuals who had simply looked at the world lacking in preparedness and decided to personally rectify the situation. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why did he come across the street?" "Fuck. He didn't have to. Nobody else did." Tank drove for a moment without answering. You know what the funniest thing about Hawk is? He didn't wait for her answer. He's the scariest looking person in any room he walks into. He knows it. He's known it since he was about 30. And he decided a long time ago that if people were going to be afraid of him anyway, he might as well be worth being afraid of. Tank paused. Then he also decided that worth being afraid of and worth trusting aren't mutually exclusive. He spends a lot of time proving that second part. Emily looked out the window at Silver Creek passing by, at streets and the familiar storefronts and the town she had lived in for 23 years without quite feeling like it belonged to her. "I'm across the street," Tank said, "because you asked and nobody else was going to." He said it like it was simple, because to him, it was. The second appointment Tank drove her to was on a Wednesday. The third was a Friday. By the fourth, Emily had stopped counting. It wasn't just Tank. Doc, whose real name was Gerald Whitmore, though she learned that much later, was a retired emergency medic who had spent 20 years working trauma units this before his back gave out, and he found his way to Hell's Angels through a chain of events he described as longer and more. It's interesting than I have time to explain right now. He appeared at Emily's apartment door on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the intersection, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a modified daily exercise routine, not generic, not downloaded from a website, but specific. Specific to her injury, her brace type, her current range of motion limitations, currently compiled from a medical reference doc, still had from his working days. "Tank told me about your back," he said, standing in the doorway. "Backing brace creates compensation patterns over time. Probably already feeling it in your lumbar spine." Emily stared at him. "Yes," she said. "I put together something that might help. I have to use it. I'm not a practicing clinician anymore. I've seen this enough times to know what works." He held out the paper. "Up to you." She took the paper. "Do you want to come in?" she said. "Only if you're comfortable," he said. She was. Ghost, she never learned his real name. After a while it stopped, seeming important, appeared in a different way. There. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. One morning, Emily woke up and the wheelchair ramp at the back entrance of her building, there, which had been reported to the landlord 14 times over the course of 2 years and fixed 0 times over the course of 2 years, repaired, properly repaired. New hardware, the right slope angle, non-slip surface strips. She asked Tank who'd done it. Tank just shrugged. Ghost noticed it needed doing. He didn't ask permission? Did your landlord give you permission to not be able to use your own building? Emily didn't have an answer for that. Bear a man with hands large in a palm of basketball and a voice so deep it sometimes vibrated slightly in Emily's sternum started appearing at the grocery store, following her. Nothing like that. Simply being there on the days she needed to carry more than her brace comfortably allowed, making the carrying disappear as a problem without making it into a moment. Also had opinions about mangoes. Strong, detailed, considered opinions about the optimal ripeness of mangoes. Amy found to her surprise that she did too. And then there was Old Jack. Old Jack was 71 years old and had been riding with Hell's Angels since before some of the younger members were born. A gray ponytail and a collection of absolutely ancient country music cassettes that he claimed still played better than any digital format, a habit of appearing on the front stoop of Emily's building on Tuesday evenings and talking with her mother. Parker had not talked to anyone, not really talked, the way Old Jack seemed to pull it out of her in a very long time. She was a woman who had reorganized her entire life around her daughter, which meant she had gradually, systematically removed from that life everything that wasn't essential to Emily's care. Her friends, her book club, the Tuesday evening pottery class she'd taken for 6 years before the insurance crisis of 2018 made spending money on anything recreational feel like a moral failing. Old Jack did not try to fix any of this. He just sat on the stoop with a cup of whatever Laura had made her, and he listened, and occasionally he said something that was either profoundly wise or completely nonsensical. Sometimes Laura laughed, actually laughed, the real kind, one that comes from somewhere genuine, and Emily, passing through the hallway on her way to bed, would hear it and stop walking for a moment, to hear it a little longer. 6 weeks in, Emily sat at the kitchen table across from her mother and said, "I don't know what to do with this." Laura looked up from the insurance form she was filling out. With them, with all of it, Emily set down her fork. Don't just do this. People don't just help without wanting something. Your physical therapist helps without wanting something. She's paid. Your neighbor Mrs. Wolski brought us soup when you had the flu last winter. She also wanted to know if we'd heard anything about the Hendersons' divorce. Laura smiled despite herself. I'm serious, Mom. Emily stopped. Heard again. I've been trying to figure out what the catch is. I can't find one, and that she paused. That scares me more than if I'd found one. Laura set down her pen. A face that had accumulated its expression over decades, not a tired face exactly, a careful one, a face that had learned to check its hope at the door before walking into rooms. She said, "What if there is always one?" "Maybe," Laura said. "Or maybe you've just only ever dealt with people who had one." She picked up her pen again. Reynolds fixed Old Jack's mother's roof 3 winters ago. They asked him to. She's 92 and lives alone, and the leak had been going for 2 months. I found out through the Veterans Network, and he just fixed it. She looked at the form. "I know things, Emily. I pay attention." Emily said nothing. "They scare people because of how they look," Laura said. "And some of that fear has earned reasons, I'm sure. I'm not naive. But the people who've been showing up here," she shook her head slowly, "remind me of your grandfather." Emily's grandfather had been a steel worker for 40 years. He'd had a handshake that could grind bone, and he'd cried at every single family graduation. He'd spent his last decade volunteering at a food bank, publicized every Saturday without exception, because, he said, having enough to eat was not a privilege, and he had learned that lesson too late in life to keep it to himself. Then he sat with that comparison for a long moment. "I'm going to keep seeing my actual therapist," she said finally. "Obviously," said Laura, "and I'm going to keep being careful." "Obviously." But maybe Emily stopped. The Ritters, maybe, her mother agreed. What neither of them knew that night, what neither of them could have known, sitting in that kitchen, filling out insurance forms under the yellowing light of a ceiling fixture that had been in need of a new bulb for 3 weeks, was that someone else was watching. I've been watching for a while now, not with concern, not with kindness. Emily had noticed a dark car parked on Birch Street twice in the past week. She had noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't quite belong in the pattern, the way your brain registers the anomaly before your consciousness catches up. That was there when she left for work and still there when she came home. Or she didn't recognize as belonging to any of her neighbors. She had told herself it was nothing. Parking in Silver Creek was limited. Parked where they could. She had almost convinced herself. Huck had noticed the car too. He hadn't said anything to Emily yet. Well, he was still watching, still waiting to understand what he was looking at. As Hawk had spent enough of his life in situations where things were not what they appeared to be on the surface to know the difference between nothing and something that was pretending to be. That was the second kind. He just didn't know yet what it was pretending to be. On a Thursday afternoon in the third week of November, Emily was at Morrison's Books, shelving a new shipment of large print novels, a section she'd suggested expanding, as a significant portion of their customer base was elderly, and large print inventory had historically been underfunded. When the bell above the door chimed and she looked up, and she didn't recognize walked in. 50s, professional, pulled back, an expression that was carefully calibrated to convey approachability while maintaining distance, of expression Emily associated with people who dealt with uncomfortable situations for a living. The woman looked around the store, located Emily, and walked directly toward her. "Parker?" she said. "Yes? My name is Patricia Wells. I'm a journalist with the Silver Creek Register." She produced a business card and held it out, hoping to talk with you about your recent relationship with members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Emily did not take the card. Looked at the woman for a long moment. "What kind of article?" she said. "Feature piece," Patricia said. "Human interest. The community has noticed the club's members spending time at your apartment building, having you to appointments. There's some concern among residents about concern," Emily said flatly. A vulnerable young woman and her association with a group that has a complicated history in vulnerable, Emily said. She paused. "I'm not vulnerable," Emily said. But her voice was completely level. "I have a physical disability. Those are not the same thing." She turned back to the bookshelf and have a relationship with the club. Several individual members have helped me with transportation and some building maintenance issues. That's the entirety of it. But the extent of their involvement is none of the register's business. Emily slid a large print copy of a mystery novel into place on the shelf. "If you want to write an article about the specific challenges of navigating Silver Creek's transit system with a mobility disability, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. That's a story that needs writing." She glanced back over her shoulder. "This one doesn't." Patricia Wells left without her interview. Let's finish shelving the novels. She did not tell Hawk about the journalist, not because she was trying to hide it from him, but because she didn't want to give him a reason to pull back. She didn't want him to look at the situation, the attention, the whispers, the very specific way Silver Creek was beginning to notice her connection to his club and decide that protecting her meant removing himself from the picture. She had seen enough people decide to protect her by leaving. She wasn't ready for that again. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known in that moment, placing the books with steady hands and a determined jaw, was that Patricia Wells was already writing her article. And that Richard Parker had already read the rough draft. Because Richard Parker had requested it. Because Richard Parker had suggested the angle. Because somewhere in a city 3 hours away from Silver Creek, in an office with a mahogany desk and a view of a river, a man who shared Emily Parker's last name was watching everything she did. And the reason he was watching had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with money. Emily drove home from the bookstore that evening with Tank had started picking her up on Thursdays because the Thursday bus route had the most inconsistent schedule of any route in Silver Creek's transit system, and Tank had determined this empirically in the course of several weeks without mentioning to Emily that he was doing so. "Quiet," Tank said, "somewhere around the third stoplight." "I'm thinking," she said. "About?" She looked out the window at Silver Creek's familiar streets, old barber shop and the diner, with the hand-painted sign in the community center, where she'd gone to a disability advocacy meeting last spring that was attended by 11 people, 3 of whom were the organizers. "About the town," she said. "What people here think of you, of the club." "We know what they think," Tank said. "Are you?" He thought about it genuinely. "Used to," he said. "When I was younger, it used to eat at me. The way people look at you before they see you, you know. They've already decided." He drummed his fingers once on the steering wheel. "Told me something a long time ago. He said, worrying about people who haven't earned the right to judge you is like asking a blind man to review your paintings. Do it. Doesn't mean his opinion means anything about your work." Emily absorbed that. "They're saying things," she said, "about me, about my being involved with the club." Journalist. Tank glanced at her. "I know. You know, Hawk knows. Been aware of it for a few days." He shrugged. He didn't say anything because he didn't want you to feel like you needed to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" "Whether to distance yourself from us." Tank said it matter-of-factly. Any of the softness that would have turned it into manipulation. "Information. The town talking is one thing. Journalists are another level. It starts to become a thing you have to manage. Not everyone wants to manage it." Emily turned to look at him fully. "Think I'd walk away?" Tank kept his eyes on the road. "You might have to. For your own sake. And if that was what you needed to do," he paused. "He'd understand." Emily sat back in her seat. She thought about the man who had crossed 4 lanes of rain-soaked street to get down on his knee on a cracked sidewalk without being asked twice. About the matter-of-factness of 6 words. "You asked the right people." She thought about Doc's exercise routine, back to her exact injury, Ghost's repaired ramp, opinion on mangoes, old Jack on the front stoop making her mother laugh. About 23 years of fighting for the space to be a full person in a world that had already decided what she was. About all the people who had defined their care for her by the conditions attached to it. "Doc," she said, "that I'm not walking anywhere." Tank looked at her then. Just for a second, just long enough for her to see that the expression on his face was not surprise. It was something quieter than that, something that looked a lot like relief. He said. He pulled up to Hawthorne Apartments and put the truck in park. Emily got out with her cane and her backpack and her brace that had not locked up once today, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November air. At Birch Street, a dark car was parked 3 spaces down from the building entrance. Looked at it for a long moment. Then she went inside. She didn't sleep well that night, not because of the car, not because of the whispers she could feel building at the edges of Silver Creek, the low hum of a town, turning its attention towards something it didn't fully understand and was already in the process of deciding was dangerous. She didn't sleep well because of the thing Tank had said. "You might have to walk away. And if that was what you needed to do, he'd understand." She lay in the dark and thought about the people who had decided to protect her by leaving, about the people who had decided to protect her by staying. And she thought about the difference between those 2 decisions, what that difference said about the nature of love and care, and the particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. About all of this until the pipes in the building made their 3A. Let him sound a long, low groan like a settling of old bones, and then she finally slept. She dreamed about the intersection at Maple and 5th. In the dream, she was standing there again. The rain, brace, the signal cycling red to green to red. This time, when she looked across the street, the overhang of the clubhouse was empty. This time, nobody came. She woke up with her heart beating too fast, reached for her phone, looked at the time, 4:47 a. Lay there in the quiet for a long moment. Then she opened her contacts. Tank's number was there, below a half dozen others. Just a name and a number, written on a gas station receipt that she had photographed and saved. She didn't call it. She didn't need to. She just needed to know it was there. She put the phone down, pulled the blanket up, and looked at the ceiling. Outside, a car engine started somewhere on Birch Street. She listened to it. It idled for a moment. Then it drove away. Not nothing then. She thought, something that was pretending to be nothing. I need to tell Hawk about the car. She fell asleep telling herself she'd do it in the morning. She did not know yet that in the morning, everything would already have changed. By the time she woke up, the dark car would be gone from Birch Street. 3 weeks later, a black SUV with a different license plate would pull up in front of Hawthorne Apartments, and a man in an expensive suit would step out. And he would say that his name was Richard Parker. He would claim to be her father. And nothing, not the locked brace, the rain, not the empty bus stop, not the journalist, the whispers building at the edges of Silver Creek. Nothing would test her the way that moment would. Because that moment would be the beginning of something she hadn't been prepared for. Something that had been building quietly, carefully, out of her sight for a long time. Something that Hawk had already sensed was coming. That Tank's first aid kit couldn't fix. Something that Doc's exercise routine wouldn't help with. Something that Ghost's repairs wouldn't hold against. I think that required a different kind of strength entirely. Something that comes not from your own resources, but from knowing exactly who is standing beside you when you need it most. The morning Richard Parker arrived in Silver Creek, Emily was running late. Not because of the bus. She had stopped relying on the bus 6 weeks ago. Around the 4th time, Tank showed up before she even had to ask. She was late because she had spilled coffee on her work shirt. Changing shirts when your left arm has limited rotation above the shoulder and your brace is already locked in its morning configuration is not a 30-second operation. It is a 7-minute operation minimum, and it requires patience she did not always have before 8 in the morning. She was buttoning the replacement shirt when she heard her mother's voice from the front room. Loud, not alarmed, but careful, the tone Laura Parker used when she was managing something she hadn't decided how to feel about yet. Really, there's a man outside. Emily finished the last button. The kind, her mother said, who came in a black SUV and is standing on the sidewalk looking at our building like he owns it. Emily walked to the window. John was in his mid-50s, tall, lean, silver-haired, in the way that reads as distinguished rather than old. His suit was the kind that doesn't come off a rack, the kind where everything fits too precisely for chance to be responsible. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the building with an expression Emily couldn't read from this angle. And he had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was very still. Something moved through Emily's chest, something cold, unspecified, oddly familiar. The way a smell can feel familiar before your brain catches up to identify it. I don't know him, she said. He asked for you by name, her mother said. At Mrs. Kowalski's door first, she sent him here. Emily stared at him for another second. Then she went downstairs. She opened the front door of Hawthorne Apartments and stepped onto the stoop. And the man on the sidewalk turned to look at her. And the first thing she noticed was his eyes. Dark brown, deep set, a particular kind of assessing quality that she had seen somewhere before and couldn't immediately place. Her? He said. Not a question. He said it the way people say something they've been rehearsing. Hers. Yes, she said. My name is Richard Parker. He let that sit for a moment. I believe I'm your father. The street did not stop. Cars still moved. A dog barked somewhere to the left. Holtold continued entirely indifferent to the fact that a sentence had just been said on the front stoop of Hawthorne Apartments that rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of Emily Parker's understanding of her own life. Said nothing. Richard Parker took a step forward. Close, careful, calculated. The step of someone who has thought about this moment. I know this is a lot, he said. I know there is no version of this that isn't a lot. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend I have a good explanation for the time. The absence. He stopped, seemed to collect himself. I've been trying to find the right moment for a long time. I don't know that there is a right moment for something like this. I'm here. Emily's hand had tightened on her cane without her consciously deciding to do that. You're here, she said. Her voice was very quiet. 23 years you're here. Yes, why? He blinked. As if the directness of the question had landed slightly off the angle he'd anticipated. Because you're my daughter, Emily. Because why now, she said, specifically. Why this week? Why this building? Why today? Something crossed his face. Fast. Gone before she could identify it. I heard you'd been going through some difficulties, he said. The disability, the financial pressure your mother is under. I wanted to help. Who told you about our financial pressure? Another flicker. Our Creek is a small town. People talk. People talk, Emily repeated. I looked at him for a long moment. This man, who had her last name and her father's brown eyes, she recognized them now. She recognized them because she had seen them in photographs. Her photographs, her mother, kept in a shoebox under the bed. The ones Laura had never thrown away and never displayed and never explained and never needed to. I mean, this man who had been a silence her whole life, a shape of absence, a question she had stopped letting herself ask because unanswered questions that live in you long enough become a kind of furniture you work around them without thinking about it. I need to get to work, she said. Emily, I work at Morrison's Books. Tuesdays through Saturdays, 9 to 5, she held his gaze. You know where I'll be. She went back inside. She stood in the hallway with her back against the closed door and her hand still tight on her cane and her heart doing something complicated and uncoordinated in her chest. And she stood there for a solid 30 seconds before she remembered how to move again. There was at the top of the stairs. Lorca Parker had a look on her face that Emily had never seen before. It wasn't shock exactly. It was the look of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen for so long that when it finally happens, the emotion that arrives is not the one they expected. Relief, not anger. Something more like the feeling of a clock. Finally stopping a silence that takes a moment to understand is silence. Oh no, Emily said. I knew he existed, Laura said. I didn't know he was coming. What do you mean you knew he existed, Mom? She told me you didn't know where he was. You said he left before I was born and you didn't. I didn't know where he was, Laura said. That's true. But I knew who he was. She came down 2 steps. This isn't the conversation for a Tuesday morning. When you're already running late, make it the conversation. Laura sat down on the 3rd step from the bottom. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter. He has money, she said. Old money. His father was in real estate, grandfather before that. When I met Richard, he'd been cut off. He was 25 and reckless, and he made choices his family didn't approve of. I was 22, and I didn't know any of that yet. She paused. If I found out I was pregnant, he'd already gone back to his family. Gone back to the money, he called once. He said he couldn't. He said the situation was complicated. The word he used, complicated. Her voice was level, completely level, with the particular levelness of someone who has had 23 years to process a wound into scar tissue. I never heard from him again. Emily sat down on the 2nd step from the bottom, right below her mother. The money, she said. He came back for something to do with money. I don't know why he came back, but that's what you're thinking. She looked at her daughter with an expression that was equal parts love and the particular sorrow of a mother who has watched her child learn 23 years, exactly the right questions to ask. I'm thinking, she admitted. Emily was late to work. Tank. He arrived in 7 minutes. She got in the truck and said nothing. For a full 60 seconds, drove without asking, because in 6 weeks, he had developed an accurate read of the difference between Emily's thinking silence and Emily's talking silence, and this was thinking silence. Then she said, a man showed up this morning. He says, he's my father. Tank's hands didn't move on the wheel. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the truck, a quality of attention, a kind of settling. The way a room changes when someone in it goes very still. Has he been in Silver Creek before today? Tank asked. That I know of. Did he say how he found you? He said people talk. Tank said nothing. An answer, is it? Emily said. It's an answer, Tank said. It's just not a complete one. He dropped her at Morrison's Books. He sat in the truck for a moment after she went inside. Then he picked up his phone. He called Hawk. "We have a situation," he said. Hawk listened to Tank's account without interrupting. He was at the clubhouse in the back room that served as an office, or at a desk that had more paper on it than it appeared capable of holding without structural failure. Herbert Such. When Tank finished, Hawk paused quiet for long enough that Tank checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "A car on Birch Street," Hawk said finally. "Was thinking the same thing," Tank said. "How long has it been parked there?" "Emily mentioned it to me about 10 days ago. But I didn't hear her. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure yet. And now? Now a man in a $3,000 suit shows up at her door saying he's her father and citing town gossip as his source of information about her finances." Tank paused. "Sir, you don't go dark for 23 years and then show up with timing like that unless something changed. Not external." Hawk was quiet again. "The car's gone this morning," Tank said. "Which means either whoever it was got what they needed or they moved to a different position." "Run the name," Hawk said. "Parker, business holdings, legal history, family, and find out if that journalist from the Register has any connections to anyone in Parker's orbit. You think it's coordinated?" "I think," Hawk said carefully, "a man who abandoned his daughter for 23 years doesn't develop a conscience on a random Tuesday morning." He stood up from the desk. "Out what changed?" "Because something changed. Always does." He hung up. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, doing the thing he did when a situation required patience, not the passive patience of waiting, active patience of watching, of letting things develop at their own speed while keeping all the threads in view. He put on his jacket. He had a stop to make. Morrison's Books was the kind of store that had refused to become anything other than what it was: no coffee bar, no gift section, no aggressively curated display of trending titles up front. Just books, organized by someone who clearly loved them, in a space that smelled like paper and something faintly warm that might have been vanilla from a candle someone had burned years ago and that had simply become part of the building's personality. Huck walked in at 11:15. Emily looked up from behind the counter, where she was processing a return, and said nothing for a moment. She said nothing because she had learned over 6 weeks that Hawk appeared when there was something to address, a chat, and he would address it at the pace that made sense to him, and not before. He reached out to the journalist. Hawk said, without preamble, at the counter, "Richard Parker. We don't have the timeline confirmed yet, but his name came up in connection with the Register story about you. He may have fed the initial framing the vulnerable young woman angle." Emily set down the book she was holding. Set it down very carefully. "The way you set something down when your hands have gone slightly unreliable." "He created the story," she said. "About me in the club. It looks that way. Why, we don't know yet." Hawk's voice was level. The timing of the story and the timing of his arrival aren't coincidental. At club on the defensive before he showed up. Wanted the ground destabilized. Emily stared at the counter for a moment. Something shifted in her face, not grief exactly, not anger exactly. Something that was the particular expression of a person who has just had a suspicion confirmed that they had very much been hoping was wrong. "Mother thinks there's money involved," she said. "It's worth looking at," Hawk said. "Do you know anything about your grandparents? Their side?" "My mother's parents are both gone." "Their side," she stopped. "I don't know anything about my father's side. I've never had reason to." "Would your mother know?" "She knew his family had money." "Money." Emily looked up. She said he'd been cut off from it when they met. There was that he went back to it when he found out she was pregnant. Hawk nodded slowly. The family had money. He was cut off. And then at some point, the money or the access to it changed. "You think someone died," Emily said. "But with old money tend to have detailed wills," Hawk said. "And detailed wills sometimes have conditions." The store was quiet. A customer in the large print section was moving slowly along the shelves. No way to hear. The bell above the door was still. Outside, Silver Creek was going about its Tuesday business. Emily thought about the shoebox under her mother's bed. Paragraphs. "There's an attorney," she said slowly. "Sir, I remember my mother mentioned someone once, a few years ago." A letter from an attorney, and she didn't talk about it, and I didn't push. I was 18 and I had enough to think about. Do you know the attorney's name? No. But my mother kept the letter. Hawk looked at her. Does she show it to you? I think, Emily said. After this morning, she might. Laura Parker kept the letter in the same shoebox as the photographs. It out that evening, without being asked, Emily had come home from work and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with the shoebox open, which was the most unambiguous thing Laura Parker had ever communicated without using words. It was from a firm in Richmond called Alderman and Shaw. 4 years ago. It was a brief formal letter that carries enormous weight in language designed to convey as little of it as possible. It informed Laura Parker, as the listed emergency contact for Emily Rose Parker just had been established in Emily's name by the estate of Margaret Catherine Parker, paternal grandmother, in the amount of $593,000, full disbursement to Emily upon the satisfaction of specific conditions as outlined in the attached documentation. The attached documentation was not in the shoebox. Not scared, Laura said. She didn't look up from the table. I understand it fully. I called the attorney a woman named Sophia Mitchell. She handled the trust and she explained the conditions. And then I didn't know what to do with it. What conditions? Emily said. Laura looked up. The trust was structured to protect you, she said. Your grandmother, Richard's mother, apparently knew her son well enough not to leave anything to him direct. It was set aside for you specifically, but the condition was that it could only be disbursed in full if it could be demonstrated that you were living with genuine, substantive support, not just financially, emotionally, or relationally, that you weren't isolated, that you had people around you who were invested in your life. Laura paused. Margaret Parker was a specific woman. She'd seen too many family members use inherited money as a substitute for actually showing up for each other. Emily stared at the letter. 3 years ago, she said, "You've known for 4 years." I didn't know what to do, Laura said again. We were struggling. We are struggling. But the moment I told you about that money, it became a target. It changed every relationship around it. Every person who tried to help would suddenly be suspect. Her voice broke slightly. Sure, just slightly. I wanted you to have real things first. I wanted the real things to come first. Emily looked at her mother, this woman who had reorganized her entire life around her daughter and never complained about it and never used it as leverage and never once made Emily feel like a burden, even though the weight of it was in every tired line of her face. He found out, Emily said. Richard found out about the inheritance. He must have wrote him out of her will specifically. Wills are public record once they're probated. If someone told him, he came back because of the money. Emily said it very quietly. Because of me. Emily, that's all right. And remarkably, incredibly, her voice was steady when she said it. Right? I'm not surprised. I don't think I was ever really surprised. She picked up the letter. She took a photograph of it on her phone. She sent it to Hawk. His response came back. In 3 minutes, I know Sophia Mitchell. Tomorrow morning, don't talk to Richard Parker again without someone with you. Emily read the message twice. She typed back, okay, almost typed thank you. She stopped herself because it felt too small for what she was feeling. Laura said, and she didn't have a larger word available yet. She put the phone down and looked at her mother. We should eat something, she said. I made soup, Laura said. Of course you did. Laura almost smiled. Not quite, almost. They ate the soup. They talked about something else entirely, a show Laura had been watching. Emily was recommending at the store, the weather forecast for the rest of the week. Ordinary conversation of people who understand that sometimes the only way to survive a large thing is to hold it alongside the small things, that the small things act as ballast. Underneath it, both of them were holding the same thought, turning it over, examining its shape. $593,000. Their mother Emily had never met. A father who had waited 23 years and driven in 3 hours to arrive on the specific day when Emily Parker had just first time in her life, the visible evidence of a genuine support network surrounding her. Tradition of the will, real support, real relationships. Old people showing up. The thought that Emily held alongside the soup and the weather forecast in her mother's voice, describing a television plot she couldn't follow without context, was this. She had not asked the Hells Angels to be witnesses on her behalf. She had not cultivated their presence strategically. Cried out from a sidewalk in the rain, and they had come. Everything that followed had come from that. Richard Parker had arrived to find something he had not anticipated. He arrived to find her surrounded. The article ran in the Silver Creek Register that Thursday. Emily read it on her phone before getting out of Tank's truck. She read it twice, then she handed the phone to Tank. I read it. His jaw did something. He handed it back. The article was careful. It was the journalistic equivalent of a slow-moving blade, nothing explicit, nothing that would survive a libel challenge, but everything shaped in a particular direction. It described the Hells Angels chapter's extensive involvement in Emily's daily life. Anonymous neighbors expressing concern about the nature of the relationship. It mentioned Emily's disability repeatedly in ways that positioned her as someone to be helped rather than a person with agency. The club's history in the region with a selection of facts that were all technically accurate and collectively misleading. Quote Emily. It quoted Richard Parker. In the third-to-last paragraph, a man identified as a family member who wished to reconnect with Miss Parker expressed concern that Emily might be in a situation she doesn't fully understand and said he hoped the relevant authorities would look into the matter. Emily read that paragraph a third time. Putting it up, she said, he's creating a record. A concerned family member, vulnerable disabled woman, there's suspicious outside influence. So that if it goes to court, he needs to demonstrate that the support you have isn't genuine, Tank said. Quietly, but his voice had an edge in it now, something controlled and focused. If the inheritance requires real support, he needs to discredit ours. Can he do that? Tank looked at her. What if we don't let him? Hawk called a meeting at the clubhouse that Friday evening. Emily came. This was notable not because she wasn't welcome. She had been welcome for weeks, but because she had never attended a formal meeting. She had been to the clubhouse twice, briefly once, to pick up a donation for the bookstore's literacy drive, and once when Doc needed to measure her brace to cross-reference a medical supplier. She had stood in the front room on both occasions and left without seeing the back. Of time, Hawk held the door. She walked in, 12 men in a room. Doc, Ghost, Bear, Old Jack, and 7 others whose names she was still learning. Folding chairs, a whiteboard with some handwritten notes she didn't try to read. Coffee in a pot that had been there long enough to be architectural. Doc stood at the front. You've all read the article, he said. The corners, and most of you have heard about Richard Parker by now. I'm not going to recap. Here's where we are. He looked at each person in the room with the efficiency of someone who doesn't repeat himself. Parker is challenging the legitimacy of this club's involvement in Emily's life. Is to have that involvement characterized as predatory or at minimum as interference that undermines her independence rather than support that demonstrates it. If he succeeds in that framing, the trust conditions become open to dispute. So he's calling us predators, Bear said. That was very flat. In the newspaper, indirectly, Hawk said, attorneys advise you to call someone something without being held responsible for it. We have records, Doc said. Several records, physical therapy progress notes that reference Emily's improved condition. We have more than that, Hawk said. We have neighbors, Professor Carla Rice at the community college, who has seen Emily's academic performance change. We have the landlord's maintenance records or lack thereof and Ghost repair documentation. He looked at Ghost at once. We have consistent documented history. And we have Sophia Mitchell, Emily said. Every head in the room turned toward her. She hadn't spoken yet. She's the attorney who managed my grandmother's trust, Emily said. She knew what the conditions were. She knew why they were written the way they were. If anyone understands what genuine support is supposed to look like according to that document, the room was quiet. Hawk looked at her steadily. Her this morning. What did she say? She said. Hawk replied, ripples, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile. that she has been waiting for this phone call for 4 years. A shift went through the room. Not loud. The particular quality of a group of people who have been holding attention they didn't realize they were holding and have just collectively released it by 1 degree. So we fight, Bear said. The truth, Hawk said, which is the same thing. Old Jack, in the back of the room, said, "Kid, how are you doing?" He was looking at Emily. Every eye followed his to her face. She sat with 12 men looking at her in a room that smelled like old coffee and motor oil, and something that was underneath all of it, simply a place where people showed up for each other. She sat with the article still open on her phone. She sat with the photograph of her grandmother's will letter in her camera roll. She sat with the shape of 23 years of silence that had just arrived on her doorstep wearing an expensive suit. "Angry," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I'm not afraid." She looked around the room. "I've been afraid for a long time, of being a burden, of taking up too much space, of needing things from people." She paused. "I'm not doing that anymore." Old Jack nodded slowly. He said, "Just that. I want to be clear about something," Emily continued. "Whatever happens with the trust, whatever happens in court, that's not why I'm here. That's not why any of this matters to me." She looked at Hawk. "I'm here because 6 weeks ago I was standing in the rain and nobody stopped there, and you did. And everything that happened after that was real. Whatever Richard Parker tells a judge, whatever that article says, whatever this town decides about me or about you, it was real." The room was very quiet. Hawk said, "We know. I want you to know that I know it too," she said. I needed to say that out loud for myself. Tank, 2 chairs to her left, said nothing. He was looking at the table. Of his hand, she noticed, was very slightly less relaxed than it usually was. Hawk cleared his throat. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," he said. Michael mentioned authorities. Richard Parker specifically used that word, which he may be in contact with Child Protective Services or Adult Protective Services. Emily is an adult, so CPS isn't relevant, but APS conducts welfare checks when there's a concern about a vulnerable adult in a potentially exploitative situation. "I'm not a vulnerable adult," Emily said. "I know that," Doc said. "The system doesn't always." He looked at Hawk. "We should be prepared for a welfare check. If one happens, it needs to go smoothly." "It'll go smoothly," Hawk said. "Because there's nothing here that doesn't hold up under examination." He looked at Emily. "Comfortable with that?" "I've been examined my entire life," she said. "Doctors, by insurance companies, by social workers, by institutions. I'm very comfortable with it." She picked up her phone and put it in her jacket pocket. Look. After the meeting, she stood outside the clubhouse for a moment in the November air. Tank came out behind her and stood nearby, not crowding her, as present, the way he was always present. "Do you think it'll go to court?" she asked. "I think Richard Parker is a man who is very accustomed to getting what he wants through enough legal and social pressure," Tank said. "Whether that works depends on how much resistance it meets." "Is Hawk good at resistance?" Tank made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. Hawk is the most stubborn person I have ever met in my life," he said. "I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps surrounded by exclusively stubborn people." Emily looked up at the November sky. "Hawk," she said, "what happens if the court decides the support isn't genuine? What happens if Richard Parker wins?" Tank was quiet for a moment. "Then you lose access to an inheritance," he said. "A genuinely unfair and terrible outcome." He paused. "But you'd still have your degree. You'd still have the job. You'd have your mother." He paused again. "And you'd still have us. None of that is conditional on a court decision." Emily looked at him. "You're sure about that?" "I was sure about it before there was any inheritance to have an opinion about," Tank said. "We didn't know about any trust when we fixed the ramp or drove you to the medical center. But we didn't do any of that because of money." His voice was quiet and completely without performance. "Or that. You know," she said. "Then that's the thing to hold on to." She held on to it. Across town, in a hotel that was the most expensive Silver Creek had to offer, Parker sat at a desk and read an email from his attorney that said the trust documentation was proving more solid than anticipated. and that the journalist article had generated social media attention, but not the kind of civic response they had hoped for, and that they might need to reconsider the timeline. Richard Parker read the email twice. He thought about his mother's will, the careful, deliberate wording of it, about the woman who had written him out of her own estate with the efficiency of someone who had thought about it for a long time and had no remaining doubts. About a 23-year-old woman with a locked brace who had cried out from a sidewalk and found something he had never anticipated. About the photograph his operative had taken from the dark car on Birch Street, the photograph of Emily at the front door of her building, surrounded by men who had no financial stake in her well-being and every evidence of genuine investment in it. He had come here to find a woman who was alone. He had not found that. A reply to his attorney, escalate. We need to move faster than we planned. He hit send. He did not know that Sophia Mitchell had already been in contact with Hawk for 24 hours. He did not know that Doc had already begun compiling medical documentation. He did not know that Ghost had photographed every repair on record at Hawthorne Apartments with timestamps and materials lists. He did not know that Emily Parker, who had spent 23 years learning to need as little as possible from the world, had, over the course of 6 weeks, become the most thoroughly witnessed person in Silver Creek. He knew none of this. He would. Sophia Mitchell drove up from Richmond on a Monday morning, 3 days after Hawk called her. She arrived at Morrison's Books at 9:15 because Hawk had told her that was where Emily would be, and because Sophia Mitchell was the kind of attorney who preferred to meet clients on their own ground rather than in conference rooms where our dynamic was already tilted before anyone said a word. Emily had been warned she was coming. She still wasn't entirely prepared for her. Sophia Mitchell was 61 years old, black, cropped silver hair, and the particular posture of someone who had spent 4 decades walking into rooms where she was underestimated and had long since converted that underestimation into a professional advantage. She carried a leather briefcase that was old enough to history and a yellow legal pad that she actually used, and she shook Emily's hand with the firmness of someone who believes a handshake is a form of communication. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Sophia said. Or anything else. She sat across from Emily at the small table in the break room of Morrison's conference room, but was private and set her legal pad on the table. I worked with Margaret Parker for 11 years. She was precise, she was patient, and she had very little tolerance for people who confused wealth with worth, particularly her son. Tell me about the will, Emily said. Looked at her steadily. How much did your mother explain? The amount, general condition, not the specifics. The specifics matter. Sophia opened the briefcase and removed a document, not a copy. Emily noticed. The original. Margaret Parker established this trust 7 years ago when she was first diagnosed with the illness that would eventually take her life. She had watched Richard for 30 years by that point. She knew exactly what he was. Sophia set the document on the table between them. She also knew about you. She had been aware of your existence since before you were born. It's not to make contact because she believed, and she told me this directly, that appearing life with money attached would poison whatever relationship might have been possible. Emily said nothing. She was looking at the document, at her grandmother's name at the top of it. Catherine Parker. She followed your life from a distance, Sophia continued. She knew about the accident. She knew about the disability. She knew about your mother's financial situation. And she made a decision. Sophia's voice was careful, but precise. She did not want to leave you money that would simply make you a target. She had seen what her family's money did to people. So she structured the trust with the condition that she believed would protect you from exactly what is currently happening. She required that I have real support, Emily said. Required that it be demonstrable, Sophia said. That there be documented evidence, medical, social, academic, community-based, that you were genuinely embedded in a network of people who cared about your well-being independent of financial interest. Sophia paused. She told me once that the loneliest thing in the world is to be surrounded by people who only love your circumstances. She didn't want that for you. Emily sat with that for a moment. Their mother had been watching, had known, had cared enough to design a protection from a distance, without ever introducing herself, without ever letting Emily know she existed, because showing up with nearly $600,000 attached to your name is not the same as showing up. Richard found out, Emily said. Richard found out approximately 4 months ago, Sophia said. Was probated 3 years after Margaret's death. There were estate complications, and once it entered public record, only a matter of time. She looked at her legal pad. A private investigator. The investigator monitored you for approximately 6 weeks before Richard made contact. The dark car on Birch Street. 6 weeks. He was watching while they were helping me, Emily said. Her voice had gone very quiet. Yes. He watched Tank drive me to appointments. Watched Doc work on my exercise routine. He watched Ghost fix the ramp. Emily looked up. He was building a case even then. Trying to find something to use, or trying to determine whether there was anything to find, Sophia said. When he determined there wasn't, when it became clear that what was happening around you was genuinely what it appeared to be, he shifted strategy. He decided if he couldn't prove the support was false, he would make the public believe it was inappropriate. The journalist, Emily said, Patricia Wells, received an anonymous tip with a very specific framing already prepared, Sophia said. Richard's attorney drafted the key language. Vulnerable woman, unusual relationship, concerned family. Her mouth did something that was not quite a smile. He is not an original thinker, but he is a persistent one. Emily looked at the document on the table. She looked at her grandmother's name. She thought about a woman she had never met who had, from a careful distance, loved her specifically enough to design a legal structure around her protection. About the shoebox under her mother's bed. Paragraphs. Can he win? Emily asked. Sophia Mitchell looked at her directly. Depends, she said, on what we bring to the courtroom, and on what he brings. She pulled the legal pad toward her. Everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out. Emily told her everything. 45 minutes. Sophia wrote without looking up, and precise, asking occasional questions that were so specific they felt like small surgical instruments, not intrusive, just exact. By the time Emily finished, the legal pad was nearly full, and Sophia had the expression of someone who has been handed a case that is more solid than she anticipated. Documentation from the club members, Sophia said. Repair records, transport. History Hawk has been compiling it since last week, Emily said. He has a contact at the medical center who confirmed the appointment records. Hawk's exercise notes are dated and signed. Ghost kept receipts for every repair material he purchased. Sophia looked up from the legal pad. Ghost kept receipts, she said. He said. Emily paused. The conversation. Ghost had said it in that quiet, matter-of-fact way of his. Standing in the hallway outside her apartment. He said that people who do things for the right reasons keep records. The records don't lie even when people do. Sophia Mitchell set down her pen at Emily for a long moment with an expression that was the most human thing Emily had seen from her so far. Grandmother, Sophia said, would have liked these people very much. Richard Parker requested a meeting with Emily the following Wednesday. He sent the request through his attorney, which was either a legal strategy or an acknowledgement that showing up unannounced a second time would not go the way the first time had gone. The message was carefully worded, conciliatory in tone, specific in nothing, a masterwork of language designed to sound like an olive branch while functioning as reconnaissance. Doc read it. He wants to see where you are, he said. Whether the article shook you, whether you're angry enough to say something useful to him, or frightened enough to negotiate, what do you recommend? Emily asked. They were at the clubhouse. She had started spending Wednesday evenings there not by design, but because Wednesday evenings had gradually become the time when Doc checked in on her exercise progress, and old Jack was usually there for reasons that were never formally explained, and Bear almost always brought food. It had become, without anyone formally deciding, it was a standing arrangement. I think you should meet him, Hawk said. Bear will be there. I'll be there if you want. You? Emily looked at him. In the room with Richard Parker? And his attorney? Is that a problem? I think Emily said carefully. Having the president of a Hells Angels chapter present at a legal meeting with my estranged father might not be the optic we're going for. Hawk looked at her. I'll wear my other jacket, he said. Emily blinked. And for the first time since the black SUV had appeared on Birch Street, she laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine, surprised out of her by a man who had just made a joke so dry it nearly didn't register. Their jacket, she said. It doesn't have the patch, he said. Completely serious. Old Jack from the corner made a sound that suggested he had heard this joke before and still found it moderately satisfying. Oh, Emily said. Okay, you can come. The meeting was held at Sophia Mitchell's temporary office space, which was a rented conference room at the Silver Creek Public Library neutral ground. Best choice for reasons she didn't explain, but that Emily suspected had everything to do with the psychological disadvantage of being reminded that you are in a public institution that belongs to the community and not to you. Richard Parker arrived with one attorney and an expression that had been carefully arranged to convey openness. It slipped slightly when he saw Hawk, just slightly, a fraction of a second. But Sophia saw it, and Emily saw it, Hawk saw it, and Richard Parker recovered quickly, extending his hand and saying, Mr. Reynolds, I've heard about your involvement with my daughter, in a tone calibrated to imply that what he had heard was not entirely complimentary. Hawk shook his hand, said nothing. Richard Parker only realized was not accustomed to people who said nothing. He was accustomed to filling silences and controlling rooms. Hawk's particular brand of silence, not hostile, uncomfortable, simply present, left him with nowhere to put his carefully prepared response. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Richard opened by expressing his concern for Emily's well-being. His attorney referenced the Register article without quite citing it. But there was language about the complexity of Emily's situation and the importance of family support and the significant resources Richard was prepared to offer. There was a pointed question about the nature of the club's involvement, phrased in a way that would have been insulting if it had been direct, but was too carefully indirect to challenge cleanly. Let him talk. When he finished, she said, Mr. I represent Emily Parker and the trust established by your mother, Margaret Catherine Parker. The trust documentation is clear. The conditions have been substantively met, and we will be presenting comprehensive evidence of that satisfaction to the court. She set a folder on the table. I also want you to be aware that we have identified the source of the anonymous tip to the Silver Creek Register. We have documentation connecting that tip to your attorney's office. That information will also be presented. Richard Parker's attorney said, a serious allegation. It's a documented fact, Sophia said pleasantly. There's a difference. Richard looked at Emily. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since the meeting began. At Sophia, not at Hawk, not at his own attorney, at Emily. I'm your father, he said. And the calibration dropped for just a moment. Careful arrangement shifted. Something underneath came through, not love. Emily didn't think it was love, but something more complicated and harder to name. Whatever this looks like, whatever your attorneys want to frame it as, I am your father, I came here because you're my daughter. Emily looked at him. She had been waiting, she realized, for this moment. Not consciously, but somewhere underneath all the documentation and the legal strategy in the meetings, she had been waiting to see what was underneath his. My biological father, she said. Her voice was level and gentle and completely without anger. Hey, that's real. I don't question that. And whatever your mother, my grandmother, felt about you, she gave me a name and a history, and that's something. She paused. But you didn't come here for me. You came here because of a trust that was specifically designed to prevent you from accessing money that was meant for me. She folded her hands on the table. I had come here 5 years ago, 3 years ago, on any Tuesday morning. Before 4 months ago, I would have had a different conversation with you. I might have wanted a different conversation. I was a 20-year-old girl who had never had a father on the corners. And if you had walked up to my apartment door without an inheritance on the table, I would have had to at least try. Richard Parker said nothing. Well, you didn't come then, Emily said. You came now. Sure. And I need you to understand that the people in my life, the people you tried to discredit in a newspaper, the people your investigator photographed from a car on my street for 6 weeks, those people were there before the money. They were there before you. They showed up because I needed help at a crosswalk on a rainy morning, and that is the beginning and the end of why they are in my life. She looked at him steadily. Sure. So no, I don't want a negotiation. I don't want whatever you're prepared to offer. I want you to go home. Richard Parker sat across the table from his daughter. The room was quiet. His attorney put a hand on his arm. It didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, and it came out differently than anything else he'd said, tired or less constructed, she talked about you. My mother. Last year, she talked about you constantly. A photograph of you from your college ID. She kept it on her desk. Emily said nothing. She said she hoped. He stopped. She said she hoped you'd found people worth trusting. He looked at the table. I think she'd be satisfied. He stood up. He gathered his papers with hands that were slightly less steady than they'd been at the start of the meeting. His attorney said something quiet about not considering the matter closed, reserving the right to proceed, about further review of the documentation. Sophia said all the appropriate things in response of someone who has won and is allowing the other side the dignity of a structured exit. Richard Parker walked to the door. He paused. He looked back at Emily one more time. His eyes. He left. The door closed. Sophia began gathering her own papers with the efficiency of someone moving on to the next task, who had sat through the entire meeting in his other jacket and said not a single word. Looked at Emily. You okay? He said. It was the same question he'd asked her with his eyes at the intersection at Maple and Fifth, a rainy morning 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. Not in words then, in the way he'd crossed the street, in the way he'd gotten down on one knee without ceremony. Emily looked at the door that Richard Parker had just walked through. About a grandmother she would never meet, who had kept her photograph on a desk and hoped that she'd found people worth trusting. About what it cost to design love from a distance when showing up directly would have complicated things beyond repair. About all the different shapes love takes when it can't take the shape it wants. She said she meant it. Sophia snapped her briefcase shut. I'll file the evidentiary documentation with the court by end of week. Richard's attorney will make noise for another 30 days and then the case will settle. She looked at Emily over the briefcase. Grandmother was right about you for what it's worth. She never met me, Emily said. Oh, Sophia agreed, but she knew what to look for. She picked up the briefcase and she recognized it when it showed up. She walked out. Huck and Emily sat in the conference room alone for a moment. The library was quiet around them. Someone was returning books at the front desk. Was asking a librarian something in a small, earnest voice. Ghost wants to know, Hawk said, if the stair railing at your building needs replacing while he's at it. Emily looked at him. She said, he noticed it's loose. He doesn't like loose railings. Emily thought about a man who kept receipts because the records don't lie even when people do. Who had fixed a wheelchair ramp without announcing it and was now apparently conducting a structural survey of her entire building's accessibility features. Tell him yes, she said. Tell him thank you. He won't want the thank you. Tell him anyway. Hawk almost smiled. Not quite. But the lines around his eyes shifted in a way that she had learned over 6 weeks meant the same thing. They walked out of the Silver Creek Public Library into the November afternoon. Somewhere across town, Richard Parker was sitting in the back of his black SUV, deciding whether to call his attorney or simply drive back to Richmond. Somewhere at Hawthorne Apartments, Ghost was testing the tension on a stair railing with both hands, quietly and without an audience, deciding what it needed. Numbers. And in a law office in Richmond, in a file cabinet that Sophia Mitchell had been maintaining for 4 years, there was a letter Margaret Catherine Parker had written to be given to her granddaughter after the trust was settled. Emily didn't know about the letter yet. She would. Sophia Mitchell filed the evidentiary documentation on a Friday, exactly as she promised. By Monday morning, Richard Parker's attorney had responded with 47 pages of counter-documentation that Sophia described Called Emily that afternoon. As voluminous but thin, she said it the way a surgeon might describe a complicated-looking incision that turned out not to have hit anything vital, technically impressive, ultimately manageable. He's going to push for a formal hearing, Sophia told Emily. If he concedes now, he gets nothing. If he pushes and loses in court, well, he still gets nothing, but at least he can tell himself he tried everything. She paused. Like Richard Parker, need the story of having tried everything, to their self-image. How long? Emily asked. The hearing is scheduled for December 14th. Close. 6 weeks. Emily looked at the calendar on her phone. 6 weeks ago, she had been standing at a crosswalk in the rain, counting seconds. A particular relationship with 6-week intervals now, a way of containing entire lifetimes. What do we need to do, she asked. You need to live your life exactly as you've been living it, Sophia said. Don't change anything. Don't perform anything. Don't make anything bigger or smaller than it already is. Richard's team will be watching for any shift that suggests the support structure is reactive rather than genuine. She let that sit. Growth is your strongest asset. Don't dress it up. Emily told Hawk what Sophia had said. He looked at her for a moment. That's the easiest instruction I've ever been given, he said. Not changing anything. She believed him. What she hadn't anticipated was how the weeks between the filing and the hearing would change Silver Creek itself. It started small, the way most genuine shifts do, not with a dramatic reversal, but with a series of small frictions that gradually wore away the prevailing narrative like water on stone. Mrs. Kowalski had directed Richard Parker to Emily's door. On the morning he arrived, and who had been quoted anonymously in the Register article as a concerned neighbor, came to Morrison's books on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 20 minutes at the large print mystery section before approaching the counter. I want you to know, she said without preamble, that I did not say what they wrote. Emily looked at her. Mrs. Kowalski said she was 73 and had lived in Silver Creek her entire life and had a face that recorded everything that had ever happened to it, which was considerable. They called me. The journalist. She asked me about the men at your building, and I said they seemed helpful and that I hadn't had any concerns. That is what I said. She set her book on the counter. They printed was different. Emily processed this. She misquoted you. She selectively quoted me, Mrs. Kowalski said, with the precision of someone who understood the difference. Looked it up afterward. There is a distinction. Emily, she paused. I want to make a statement. To the attorney, that woman from Richmond. I want to say what I actually said. Emily called Sophia from the back room. Sophia drove up from Richmond the following day. Mrs. Kowalski's statement was the first. It was not the last. Professor Carla Reese from the community college submitted a written account of Emily's academic trajectory over the past year, the specific improvement in attendance, quality of her coursework, the confidence she brought to class discussions about disability advocacy that had noticeably deepened in recent months. Professor Reese wrote, with the controlled enthusiasm of someone who has watched a student find themselves and wants the record to reflect it accurately. Two neighbors from Hawthorne Apartments, the Garcias from the 3rd floor, who had seen ghost work on the ramp and the stair railing and had initially been suspicious and had then watched carefully conclusions, offered to testify about what they had observed. Who ran the pharmacy on Route 9, submitted a note confirming that since October, Emily's prescription pickup schedule had become consistent for the first time in 2 years, which was relevant because consistent prescription pickup correlates directly with consistent transportation, correlates directly with Tank's driving schedule. It was not dramatic, it was not cinematic, it was the slow, fundamental accumulation of documented truth, one small piece at a time, the way a case is actually built by people who care more about what's real than about what looks good. Watch it happen with the particular satisfaction of someone who had bet on the right thing and is watching the odds resolve correctly. There was one moment that cut through all the accumulation like something clean and unexpected, and it happened on a Wednesday evening at the clubhouse. It was there for the standing Wednesday arrangement. Docs check in, told Jack's presence, Bear's food when Hawk came in from the back with an expression she hadn't seen on him before.
Good.
Exactly. Not surprised exactly. Something between those two things. Something that required a name she didn't have readily available. There's someone here, he said. Outside. He asked for you specifically. Who? Hawk paused in a way that was not his usual pause. Not the pause of someone choosing their words, the pause of someone genuinely uncertain how to frame something. He says his name is James. He says he's Margaret Parker's personal attorney. Just attorney, a different one. He says Margaret left something for you that Sophia wasn't aware of. Emily stood up. That's not possible, she said. Sophia handled the estate. He says it was kept separate intentionally. Hawk looked at her steadily. I ran the name in the last 10 minutes, James Alderman. The name is real. The credentials are real. And he drove 4 hours today specifically to find you. Emily walked outside. Alderman was in his late 60s, slight, with reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, and the careful manner of someone who has spent a lifetime handling other people's most important matters. Plus, he was standing next to a car that was neither expensive nor cheap functional, maintained holding a manila envelope. Miss Parker, he said, apologize for the manner of this. Margaret was specific about the timing. She didn't want this delivered until the legal process surrounding the trust was actively underway. It would have more meaning in context. He held out the envelope. She wrote this herself, 2 months before she died. Emily took the envelope and was on the front in handwriting she had never seen before. Clear, deliberate, slightly formal, the handwriting of someone from a generation that was taught penmanship as a discipline. She asked me to tell you one thing before you read it, James Alderman said. She said to tell you that she was not proud of every choice she made, but she was proud of the one she made about you. He got back in his car. He drove away. Emily stood outside the clubhouse holding the envelope with her grandmother's handwriting on it and did not move for a long moment. Tank appeared in the doorway, looked at her, looked at the envelope, said nothing, stepped back inside and pulled the door, not quite closed enough privacy, enough proximity, the precise calibration of someone who understood the difference. She opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on cream-colored stationery. She read it standing outside in the November air, and her face moved through things that she would not have been able to name in sequence that required the full range of a human face to express. She read it to the end, and then she stood with the 3 pages in her hand and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. Then she went back inside. She sat down at the table. Old Jack looked at her. Bear looked at her. Doc looked at her. Was next to her, without making a thing of it. Doc sat across from her. She set the letter on the table. She didn't offer it to anyone, but she said she knew about the accident. I was 9. She sent money to my mother anonymously, not a lot. Her covered the first round of physical therapy. Her never knew where it came from. She stopped. She said she watched me grow up a distance because she was afraid that introducing herself with her last name would make me feel like the money was the relationship. So she didn't want to be my grandmother the way a credential is a credential. Emily looked at the letter. She said she hoped that by the time I read this, I'd already know what real support felt like, so that the money was, she used the word surplus. She wanted the money to be surplus, something that helped but wasn't the thing itself. The room was quiet. She sounds, old Jack said finally, very gently, like someone who thought about things very carefully. She sounds lonely, Bear said. Came out with the directness that was simply how Bear communicated, softness but without cruelty. She sounds like someone who did the best she could with what she decided was right, and who was lonely because of it. Emily looked at him. She said, she does. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She would read it many more times. She would read it until the paper softened at the folds and the handwriting became as familiar as a voice. Right now, she simply held it and let the room be what it was: 7 people at a table in a clubhouse in Silver Creek, Virginia, on a Wednesday evening in November, connected to each other by a series of small decisions that had begun with a locked brace and a rainy intersection and 6 words. Hearing is in 4 weeks, she said. We'll be ready, Hawk said. She believed him. She had stopped being surprised by how completely she believed him. Other weeks before the hearing were the strangest of Emily's life. That was saying something. Given the competition, Richard Parker made 2 more attempts at contact. The first was through his attorney, their carefully worded communication that Sophia deflected with the efficiency of someone swatting away something that was technically an insect, but not actually a threat. Second was a handwritten note delivered to Morrison's books. Emily read once, recognized as another reconnaissance mission dressed as Olive Branch, and handed to Sophia without comment. The note said he wanted to do right by her. It said he'd made mistakes. It used the word complicated 3 times, which Emily had come to understand was Richard Parker's word for situations he had created that he preferred not to take direct responsibility for. She felt something reading it. Not softness, she wasn't ready for softness and wasn't sure she owed it. Something more complicated than anger. Something in the vicinity of the particular sadness that comes from seeing clearly the gap between what a person could have been and what they chose to be, understanding that the gap is real and that nothing in the current moment can close it. I held the note with Sophia. Nobody outside the club and Sophia's office knew what Richard Parker's investigator had not managed to determine because it happened inside the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening with no audience, was that Hawk had spent 3 weeks quietly building a piece of the case that he had not told Emily about, not because he was hiding it, because he was not certain until the night before the hearing that it was going to work. I told her the night before the hearing. He came to Hawthorne Apartments at 7 in the evening and sat at the kitchen table across from Emily and Laura Hunters, and he set a folder on the table and he said, I need to tell you something and I need you to understand that I did this because I thought it was right. And if you disagree with that, I'll hear you out. Emily looked at the folder. Does it? Richard's private investigator, Hawk said, who ran the surveillance from the dark car on Birch Street. I found him 3 weeks ago. His name is Carl DeVoe. He's been working for Parker's family for years, and he's been uncomfortable with this particular job since approximately the 4th week of his assignment. Uncomfortable why? Laura asked. Because what he was watching was not what he'd been told he was watching, Hawk said. He was told he'd find evidence of exploitation, predatory behavior, vulnerable woman being manipulated. He looked at Emily for 6 weeks and found the opposite. He found exactly what was actually there. And he is, as it turns out, a man with a conscience that became increasingly difficult to manage as the weeks went on. Emily stared at him. He tried to testify. He submitted an affidavit to Sophia this afternoon, Hawk said, documenting the full surveillance timeline, everything he observed, and explicitly contradicting the characterization that Parker's team has been building. He paused. Also documented the moment Richard Parker directed him to share specific information with Patricia Wells at the register. Specific framing, the language about vulnerable woman, concerned family, he has emails. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Nurse said very quietly, "Oh my God." Emily looked at the folder. "Why did he do it?" she said. Hawk considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said, and I'm giving you his words. I think they matter. He said that in 30 years of investigative work, he had never watched someone be as genuinely cared for as you were. And he said he was not willing to be the instrument of destroying something real in order to benefit someone who had forfeited the right to an opinion about your life 23 years ago. Emily sat with that for a long moment. 30 years of investigative work, a man she'd never met, to find something wrong, who had watched long enough to understand what right looked like. About ghost receipts. She thought about Mrs. Polsky correcting the record. She thought about the pharmacy on Route 9 and Professor Rice and the Garcias on the 3rd floor and a grandmother keeping a photograph on a desk. About how truth, when it's actually true, is a way of accumulating witnesses whether you ask for them or not. "Hey," she said. "Okay," Hawk said. "Okay," she said again. "At court tomorrow, and we tell the truth, and we have more truth than they were planning for, and that's going to have to be enough." She looked at him. Letters. Is it enough? Hawk said without hesitation, it's more than enough. The hearing was held in the Hanover County Courthouse, which was the relevant jurisdiction for the trust. A large hearing trust disputes rarely generate the kind of audience that criminal proceedings do, but the gallery was not empty either. That expected perhaps a handful of observers. 37 people in the gallery. Emily counted them. Of it, she recognized most of them. Professor Reese, there's Sia's, Mrs. Kowalski, who had gotten up at 6 in the morning to drive 40 minutes to be here. Pharmacist from Route 9. Two women from Emily's disability advocacy group who had heard about the hearing through channels Emily hadn't tracked. A reporter from a Richmond paper who was not Patricia Wells. In the back 3 rows, the Hells Angels. Not in full club gear, they had made a collective, unannounced, entirely voluntary decision to wear plain clothes. Big men, still themselves, but without the visual shorthand that the town had spent 20 years using to avoid having to look further. Emily saw them when she walked in and stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Tank in the second-to-last row caught her eye and gave her the smallest possible nod. That meant, we're here, keep walking. She kept walking. Their Park sat at the other table with 2 attorneys. He looked at the gallery once and then looked at the front of the room and did not look at the gallery again. Was a woman named Honorable Patricia Gaines, late 50s, with reading glasses that she wore without apology, and the manner of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible argument and is waiting, always, for the version that has the quality of being true. Sophia Mitchell opened. She was precise and she was thorough, and she was, Emily would think later, the most efficient person she had ever watched work. 32 minutes she laid out the full evidentiary case, the documentation of support, testimony of witnesses, the surveillance affidavit from Carl DeVoe, direct connection between Richard Parker's office and the framing of the Register article. Presented it the way Margaret Parker had apparently done everything, fully, patiently, with no tolerance for confusing wealth with worth. Richard Parker's lead attorney, a man named Garrison, who had the confidence of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds, spent 35 minutes arguing that the nature of the support was inappropriate, that the involvement of motorcycle club in a disabled woman's daily life raised questions about the club's motives. The surveillance affidavit was from a compromised source, given DeVoe's association with the Parker family. Judge Gaines stopped him. Counselor, she said, the affidavit you're describing as compromised is from your client's own investigator, whom your client hired and paid, who observed the situation your client hired him to surveil, who was contradicting your client's characterization of what he saw. She looked at him over her glasses. You're asking me to discount the testimony of your own witness on the grounds that he was too close to the situation. Garrison said, Honor, the impartiality of the move on, Judge Gaines said. Emily sat very still at the plaintiff's table and looked at her hands. Sophia had told her not to react to the arguments, characterizations, to whatever Richard Parker's team said about her. She had said, the record is what matters, not the performance. Let me handle the performance. Emily was handling it. She was keeping her hands still and her face neutral, and she was counting numbers as she always counted, not seconds this time, but something else. The things that were real. Tank's first aid kit, Doc's handwritten exercise routine, of the repaired ramp, her mother's laugh on a Tuesday evening with old Jack, the way Bear said the word mango with sincere conviction, trading cream-colored stationery from a woman she never met who had called the money surplus. Those things. She had enough of them to get through 35 minutes of being characterized as someone who needed to be protected from her own life. Testimony phase was shorter than Emily expected. Kowalski testified to what she had actually said and what the Register had printed. The discrepancy was not subtle. Professor Rice testified with the controlled precision of someone who has spent 30 years making academic arguments and knows exactly how to make a record. DeVoe testified last, in a voice that was quiet and steady and had the particular quality of someone who has made a decision and is done second-guessing it. Pearson cross-examined DeVoe for 18 minutes. His answers did not change. They did not change because they were true, and true things have a stability under pressure that constructed things do not. Garrison pushed at the edges. Their framing, the methodology of the surveillance, responded with the patience of someone who had documented everything and knew that the documentation said what it said regardless of how the questions were phrased. When Garrison finished, Judge Gaines looked at her notes for a moment. Then she looked up. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess," she said. "I'm going to give you my ruling," the gallery murmured. Emily looked at Sophia. Sophia looked back at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in that vicinity. 30 minutes, Emily said. "She already knows," Sophia said quietly. 30 minutes is procedural. Emily turned around in her chair. Back of the gallery, Hawk was sitting exactly as he'd sat through the entire hearing, straight back, there present. When her eyes found his, he did not smile, not nod, did not perform reassurance. He simply looked at her with the same expression he'd had on a rainy sidewalk. On an October morning, the expression that said, "I'm here, and I am not going anywhere, and this is the only relevant fact." Her back to face the front. She waited 30 minutes. She did not count the seconds. She didn't need to anymore. There, Judge Gaines returned and settled her papers and looked at the courtroom over her glasses. "This case," she said, "involves a trust with a specific and deliberately designed condition. The condition was established by the settler, Margaret Catherine Parker, to ensure that her granddaughter would receive not merely financial support, but substantive human investment that money cannot purchase and cannot replicate." She paused. "Here before me is comprehensive. The documentation of the support provided to Emily Parker by the individuals in question is thorough, consistent, and absent any evidence of financial motivation on the part of those individuals." Garrison shifted in his seat. Characterization of that support as inappropriate or potentially exploitative is not supported by any credible evidence in this record, Judge Gaines continued. Characterization of Emily Parker as a vulnerable adult in need of protection from her own relationships is directly contradicted by the testimony, academic record, the medical record, and the documented observations of the petitioner's own investigator. She looked up from her papers, and who asks for help at an intersection and builds a genuine community from that moment forward is not a vulnerable adult. She is a resilient one. The gallery was completely silent. Conditions established by Margaret Catherine Parker have been satisfied, Judge Gaines said. Full disbursement to Emily Rose Parker will proceed as structured. Her petition is denied. The gavel came down. Redmondesum's gallery was not silent. It happened the way things happen when 37 people have been holding a collective breath for an hour and a half and are suddenly permitted to release it, not explosion, not celebration, but the sound of a room resuming its natural state, warm and human and somewhat overwhelming. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table and felt Sophia's hand briefly on her shoulder. A single moment of contact from a woman who did not typically make those gestures, which made it mean considerably more. She turned around. Angels in the back rows were not cheering. They were not making noise of any kind. They were doing what they did present, themselves. But Bear had his hand pressed flat against his chest. His eyes were bright. Old Jack had his hands folded on his knee and was looking at Emily with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who has lived long enough to have seen many things. That didn't go right, finally watching one that did. Frost was looking at the floor, but the particular quality of the way he was looking at the floor suggested that he was managing something internal that he preferred to manage privately. Emily understood that. She respected it. Tank was looking at her. When their eyes met, he said nothing he didn't need to. Look at Hawk last. He was already standing. Because they were all beginning to stand, shifting into motion. He looked at her across the room with the dark, almost steady eyes that she had first seen across a rain-soaked intersection, eyes that had taken in her situation and assessed it and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. She mouthed 2 words at him across the courtroom. She had tried over the past 6 weeks to find larger words. Our words words that were adequate to the weight of what she was trying to carry across the distance between where she had been and where she was now. She had not found larger ones. She mouthed, "Thank you." Huck held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The same single nod he'd given her on the sidewalk after the brace released the nod of a man who has added something to a mental list and considers it complete. He moved toward the aisle. Emily turned back to the front. Richard Parker and his attorneys were gathering their things at the other table. Richard had his back to the room. He did not look across. Although he was doing something with his briefcase that seemed to require more attention than it actually required. Emily looked at him for a moment. She had not forgiven him. She was not in the place where forgiveness was available as an option. He was not going to pretend otherwise because she had made a decision some weeks ago to stop managing her emotions into shapes that were more convenient for other people. She did not hate him. What she felt, looking at his back across a courtroom, was something more like grief, the specific grief of an irreversible absence, something that happens when you fully understand that a door has been closed long enough, that the frame has grown over it, and there is no version of opening it now that doesn't require destroying what grew there instead. She felt that. She felt it fully, and then she picked up her bag, and she stood up, and she walked toward the gallery where 37 people were waiting. There was Tom standing at the end of a row with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes doing something complicated and bright. Emily reached her mother. Laura Parker pulled her daughter into her arms with the particular force of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. They stood like that for a moment. Emily had her face against her mother's shoulder, and she was breathing, just breathing, and she could feel the room around them, the warmth of it, 37 people, talking and moving and being alive in the same space. She said. "I know," Laura said. Her voice was completely broken in the most constructive possible way. "She paid for my first physical therapy," Emily said. All those years ago, Laura went very still. "Margaret Parker," Emily said. "She sent the money." She was watching. Laura pulled back just enough to look at her daughter's face. Her expression did something that Emily had never seen on her mother's face before. An expression that was grief and relief and something like wonder, particular wonder of discovering that a kindness you received a long time ago had a name, a person behind it, had not been random, but intentional. "I kept the receipt," Laura said. "I always kept the receipt. I never knew who she stopped. I wrote thank you into the air every year. I wrote it into the air." Emily thought about a woman in Richmond with a photograph on her desk, keeping receipts of her own kind. "I think she heard it," Emily said. "Drive back to Silver Creek took 40 minutes. Drove. Emily was in the passenger seat. Her mother was in the back. Nobody said much for the first 20 minutes, which was fine. The silence was the kind that doesn't need filling, kind that has been earned. Then Laura said, from the back seat, "What happens now?" Emily looked out the window at the Virginia landscape going by, bare trees and the gray sky and the familiar road home. Sophia says, "The disbursement will take about 60 days, she said. There are structural things, administrative things." She thought about it. I want to finish my degree. That's the first thing. I want to find a way to use," she paused. "There's a lot of money. There's more money than I know what to do with," which is a strange thing to say and also a completely true thing to say. "I don't want it to be the point. My grandmother didn't want it to be the point." "What do you want to be the point?" Laura asked. Emily thought about her job at Morrison's Books, the large print section she'd expanded. Disability advocacy meetings with 11 people, 3 of whom were organizers. The day she'd stood at a crosswalk unable to move and nobody had stopped. "Build something," she said. "Something that makes it less likely that someone gets stuck at a crosswalk alone." She turned it over. Just transportation, accessibility. A resource center for people with physical disabilities in Silver Creek. There are 37 small towns within 50 miles of here that have the same problems I had: buses that don't show up, buildings without ramps, people navigating systems alone because nobody showed them how. She paused. I know how to navigate those systems now. I've had help. I'm gonna pass that forward. The car was quiet. Tank said, taking his eyes off the road, Ghost knows contractors. Emily looked at him. If you're talking about building something, Tank said, physically building something, Ghost knows every contractor in a 3-county radius, and he knows which ones do their work right the first time. I haven't even found a location yet, Emily said. Comes before knowing a contractor, Tank said. I'm just saying, for when you get there. Emily looked at him for a moment. About the first time she'd gotten in this truck, getting a gas station receipt with a phone number on it, arguing with herself about whether she had the right to use it, about how much distance existed between that moment and this one. That distance was not measured in weeks, but in something that didn't have a clean unit of measurement, in small decisions and presences and receipts kept for the right reasons, and doors crossed without being asked twice. Mike, she said. Yeah. When I opened the resource center, she said, I want you to teach a course. He glanced at her. On what? On what you told me that first day. About the in-between. She looked at him steadily. What it feels like when the signal goes out and nobody talks about that part. About how to be around someone who's dealing with that. She paused. People don't know how to help. They want to sometimes. They just don't know how. And you do. Tank drove for a moment. Look, you're asking a Hells Angels member to teach a disability support course, he said. I'm asking the person who kept a first aid kit in every vehicle he's ever owned because he stood helpless for 11 minutes and decided never again, she said. I don't particularly care what he wears to class. Another moment of quiet. Tank said. Okay, yeah, okay. In the back seat, Parker made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. Roads of Silver Creek opened up ahead of them, familiar and ordinary, and in the way that ordinary things sometimes become when you've been away from them long enough to see them clearly, only beautiful in their specificity, the particular angle of late afternoon light on wet pavement, hardware store with the hand-painted sign, the diner, the community center, the intersection at Maple and Fifth, where everything had started. Tank slowed at the signal. Emily looked at the crosswalk. She looked at the spot on the sidewalk where the cane had jammed between the cracks. The overhang across the street where 12 men had been standing in the rain. They turned green. Tank drove through. Emily faced forward, and she did not count the seconds. And outside the truck window, Silver Creek was ordinary, and November and entirely, completely hers. The disbursement came through on a Thursday in February, 63 days after the hearing. Sophia called Emily at 8:14 in the morning, which was earlier than Sophia typically called anyone, told Emily everything she needed to know about how Sophia felt about the outcome before she said a single word. Sophia said, the funds cleared this morning. The trust is fully dissolved and the assets are yours. Free and clear, no remaining conditions, no further legal exposure. She paused for exactly one beat. Grandmother would be satisfied. Emily sat on the edge of her bed with her phone and said nothing for a moment. $593,000. The number was the same number it had always been. It had not changed because a judge ruled in her favor. It had not changed because Richard Parker drove back to Richmond and stopped returning his attorney's calls. There was what it had always been, a woman's careful love, expressed in the only language her family had ever trusted, converted finally into something Emily could actually use. Thank you, Sophia, she said. Thank you for being worth fighting for, Sophia said. Because she was Sophia Mitchell, she hung up immediately after, but before the moment could become sentimental in a way that would have made her uncomfortable. Emily sat for another minute. Then she called Tank. Up on the first ring. Yeah, it cleared, she said. Then you okay? I'm going to find a building today, she said. I need someone who knows someone. Ghost's been holding a short list for 3 weeks, Tank said. Others. He didn't say anything because he didn't want to pressure you, but he has a short list. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Ghost. Of course, Ghost had a short list. Tell him I'm ready, she said. Ghost had ranked first. List was a former community health clinic on Warren Street that had closed 2 years earlier when the county consolidated services. A structurally sound ghost had assessed it personally, being asked on a Sunday in January, and it was centrally located, accessible by the two most reliable bus routes in Silver Creek, and had a parking area large enough for vehicles with wheelchair lifts. It was also, Ghost had noted in his characteristic way, already up to code on most accessibility requirements because it had been a health clinic. The renovation cost was manageable rather than prohibitive. Emily walked through it with Ghost on a Friday afternoon. He didn't narrate, walked the space and occasionally stopped and looked at something and said one or two words, load-bearing, original wiring, good bones, and Emily followed him and asked questions, and he answered them precisely and without elaboration. By the time they finished, she understood the building the way you understand something when someone who genuinely knows it shows it to you. Can you project manage the renovation? She asked him, standing in what had been the main waiting room. Ghost looked at her. I'm not asking you to do the work, she said. I'm asking you to oversee it, to be the person who knows whether it's being done right. She paused. You already know what right looks like. You've known since the ramp. Ghost was quiet for a long moment in the way that was specifically his not reluctance, uncertainty, but the particular internal processing of someone who rarely makes commitments he doesn't fully mean. But he said, yeah, he said again. She offered her hand. He shook it with the gravity of someone for whom a handshake is a binding document. She signed the lease on the building 11 days later. She named it the Margaret Parker Resource Center, which she had decided on the morning after the hearing and had not second-guessed once. It was not a complicated decision. Her grandmother had built something careful and intentional from a distance for 23 years. The least Emily could do was put her name on the door. The Register ran a story about the Resource Center in March. Not Patricia Wells, a different journalist, a younger man named David Chen, who had come to Silver Creek 6 months earlier and who had the specific quality of someone who was still in the stage of his career where he believed that the point of journalism was to find what was actually true and tell people about it. He called Emily and asked if he could come talk to her about the center. She said yes. He came on a Tuesday afternoon and they talked for 2 hours, and he asked good questions, not about the lawsuit, about Richard Parker, not about the Hells Angels in the way journalists sometimes asked about them. A particular framing that was really just a more sophisticated version of the Register's original angle. He asked about the center, about what it would do, who it was for, about what Emily had learned in the past 4 months, about what people with disabilities actually needed from their communities versus what their communities thought they needed. For a long time about that last question. So its article ran the following Sunday. It was thorough and accurate, and it said the things that needed saying. It mentioned the club by name not as a complication, as a controversy, but as what they were. The people who had shown up first read it at the clubhouse and said nothing, which was his version of approval. Earl Jack read it and said, about time, which was his version of a standing ovation. Response was not immediate. Real things rarely announce themselves loudly in their early stages. Over the following weeks, Emily began receiving calls from disability advocacy organizations in neighboring counties, a physical therapist in Staunton who wanted to know if the center would be able to offer subsidized sessions, from a woman in Charlottesville who had a son with cerebral palsy and had been driving 45 minutes each way for every appointment for 3 years and had read the article on her phone at a traffic light and pulled over to the shoulder to finish it. Last call lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, Emily sat at her desk in the not yet renovated resource center. She had set up a folding table and a chair in the corner of the former waiting room where she worked in the mornings before Morrison's books. And she held the phone in her lap and thought about a woman pulled over on a highway shoulder, reading about a place that might help her son. She thought about the wait of 45 minutes each way, appointment for 3 years, the particular exhaustion of caring for someone while also navigating a system that was not designed with you in mind. required you to spend a significant portion of your finite daily energy just fighting for access to the things that were supposed to be available to everyone. About what it would mean to reduce that distance. Eliminate, she was not naive about what one resource center in one small Virginia town could accomplish. Reduce. Make the in-between smaller. She thought about Tank explaining the in-between on their first drive together. Told him, I need you to start thinking about the curriculum, she said. The course. I have a target opening date 1st of June. That gives you 3 months. I've been thinking about it since January, Tank said. Of course you have, Emily said. I have about 40 pages of notes. Of course you do. She could hear him almost smiling through the phone. The particular quality, the silence that meant he was managing something that wanted to become a real smile and was keeping it calibrated. He said, yeah, this is a good thing you're building. She looked around the former waiting room. Frost's short list notes were pinned to the wall next to her folding table, a detailed renovation timeline, sales lists, contractor schedules, all of it organized with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between a good plan and a bad one is not intelligence, but attention. We're building it, she said. The renovation took 11 weeks. Ghost ran it with an efficiency that surprised the contractors and did not surprise anyone who had spent significant time around Ghost. On site every day. He caught 2 specification errors before they became structural problems. Renegotiated a materials contract that saved $14,000. Personally installed the automatic door openers on both entrances on a Saturday when the scheduled crew couldn't make it, arriving at 7 in the morning with his own tools and finishing by noon. They came by on that Saturday afternoon and found him testing the doors. He opened and closed them 6 times, watching the mechanism, small adjustments. They're good, she said. They need to be right, he said. Not just good. She watched him test them a 7th time. She said, can I ask you something? He waited. Why did you fix the ramp? She said, the very first time. Or you knew me. Before any of this, you just fixed it. He was quiet for a moment, testing the door a 8th time. Because it was broken, he said. He looked at her then, directly, which he did less often than most people. You needed it fixed. The landlord wasn't going to fix it. Could fix it. He turned back to the door. That's the whole equation. Emily thought about that equation. The mechanical simplicity of it. The refusal to make it more complicated than it was, or to extract from it more credit than it deserved. About how much of the world's difficulty came from people making that equation complicated on purpose, adding terms, adding conditions, adding the invisible invoice that turned help into transaction. Thank you, she said. You've said that, he said. I'll probably keep saying it. He made a sound that was not quite a response. But he didn't tell her to stop. The Margaret Parker Resource Center opened on June 3rd. It was a Tuesday. Emily had not planned that. She had planned for June 1st, was a Saturday, but there had been a final inspection delay and the opening shifted by 3 days. And it was only afterward that she realized it was a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the morning at the intersection. The day the bus hadn't come. The same day she'd stood in the rain counting seconds while Silver Creek moved around her without stopping. She didn't think it was a coincidence, exactly. She thought it was the kind of thing that happens when you're paying attention. 30 people came to the opening, then 40. Then by 11 in the morning, something closer to 70 people who had read the article, people who had heard from someone who had heard from someone, people who simply drove by and saw the doors open and the automatic openers working, and something in them responded to the evidence of a place that had thought about them before they arrived. Professor Reese came. The Garcias came. Mrs. Kowalski came and spent 20 minutes inspecting the large print resource library that Emily had set up in the corner closest to the windows, and then came to find Emily and said, this section is well organized, which from Mrs. Kowalski was the highest possible accolade. Sophia Mitchell came up from Richmond. There's not the corners, which she had not announced she would do, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking with the expression of someone conducting an internal evaluation and finding the results acceptable. She shook Emily's hand. She looked at the plaque on the wall, Margaret Parker Resource Center, and underneath it are letters. A line from the letter, "No money be surplus. Let the real things come first." Sophia looked at the plaque for a long moment. She would have walked in here, Sophia said, and she would have found something to criticize because that's how she showed respect. Respect. She paused. Then she would have funded the next phase. Emily laughed. She said, "I feel like I know that about her." "You do," Sophia said. "Her quite well, actually, given everything." She moved into the room, and Emily stood by the door, and the morning continued. Those angels arrived at noon. Not in a group, not formally. They arrived the way they did most things, individually and without announcement, filtering in over the course of 20 minutes. Doc, then Bear, then Doc, then Old Jack, then Ghost, who had been there since 7 in the morning but been in the utility room, making a final adjustment to the HVAC system, and emerged now, wiping his hands on a rag, looking at the room with the specific satisfaction of someone who built something and is seeing it used correctly for the first time. Came last. He walked in and stood just inside the door and looked around the room at the people, at the resource displays, at the folding chairs, arranged in a circle for Tank's first community session that afternoon, plaque on the wall, at the automatic doors, opening and closing as people came in and out with the particular ease of a mechanism that was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Emily walked over to him. They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the room. "It's real," she said. "It is," he said. "I keep expecting it not to be." "It's real," he said again. Not more gently, not more emphatically, just confirmed, the way he confirmed things. Once with certainty, and then he moved on because repetition wasn't his language. I looked at him. She had been trying for weeks, find the right moment for what she wanted to say. She had drafted it in her head several times, and each time it had felt either too large or too small for the actual thing she was trying to carry across the space between them. She had decided finally that there was no right version, that the wrong version said honestly was better than the right version never said at all. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "I've spent most of my life," she said, "trying to be someone who didn't need things. As needing things meant asking, and asking meant owing, and owing meant that eventually someone would hold the debt over me, instead of carrying me, or decide I was too much." She stopped. "I built my whole life around being as little as possible, taking up as little space as possible, needing as little as possible." She looked at the room. Then I stood at a crosswalk, and I ran out of options, and I asked, "Hello," and you came across the street, and you didn't hold it over me. You didn't get tired. You didn't decide I was too much. She looked back at him. It changed something in me that I don't think is going back. Hawk was quiet for a moment. "You were never too much," he said. "You were just in the wrong places." She thought about that. Being in the wrong places this long enough that you started to believe the wrong places were telling you the truth about yourself. "I know that now," she said. He nodded, the single nod. He said. And then because he was Hawk, and because he had said what needed saying and had no interest in ornamenting it, the session starts at 2. He's nervous. Emily looked across the room at Tank, who was arranging chairs with slightly more precision than chairs required. That was his version of nervous. "Tank is nervous," she said. "He's been rehearsing since April," Hawk said. "Don't tell him I told you that." Emily crossed the room. She stopped next to Tank. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he said. He adjusted a chair that didn't need adjusting. "You've got 40 pages of notes," she said. "They're a cater. You've been thinking about this since January. You know what you're going to say. Knowing what you're going to say and saying it in front of people are different things," he said. "Give me something," she said. "Why did you keep that first aid kit in every vehicle?" He stopped moving the chair. "That was useless for 11 minutes, he said. "And I decided never again." "That's your first sense," she said. "There." He looked at her. Something in his face settled, a particular settling of someone who has found the right beginning and can now follow the thread from there. "Oh, okay," she said. She went back to the door. At 2 o'clock, Tank stood in front of 14 people, arranged in a circle of folding chairs in the Margaret Parker Resource Center in Silver Creek, Virginia. And he said, "My name is Thomas Briggs, and 15 years ago I was useless for 11 minutes. I decided never again, and that decision is the reason I'm standing here today." He did not look at his notes once. Emily stood at the back of the room and listened. She thought about what Ghost had said in the doorway of the resource center. They're testing the automatic opener for the 8th time. The radical simplicity of the equation. Needed fixing. Could fix it. That's all. She thought about what Tank had told her on the first drive, about the in-between, about the gap where the signal goes out and nobody talks about it. His buddy from Fallujah picking up something and having it not be there. The world wanting to talk about the pain and never understanding that the in-between was what got to him. About standing at a crosswalk, counting seconds. About 6 words. She thought about what it cost a person to ask. It cost the world when nobody answered. And what it meant, what it actually, or specifically, concretely meant in a person's life when someone crossed the street. Outside, Silver Creek went about its Tuesday business. Ran on its irregular schedule. The hardware store had its hand-painted sign. Served its regular lunch crowd. The intersection at Maple and 5th cycled through red and green without caring about any particular person's ability to cross it. Inside the Margaret Parker Resource Center, 14 people sat in a circle and listened to a large man with 40 pages of notes. He didn't need to tell them something true about being present for someone who is struggling. And every single one of those 14 people had come because they were either struggling themselves or loved someone who was, and every single one of them was going to leave knowing something they hadn't known when they arrived. That was one afternoon, one session, 14 people. Truth, when it's actually true, accumulates witnesses. Emily knew that now. She had learned it from a courtroom and a private investigator and a journalist corrected record and a grandmother who kept her photograph on a desk. Learned it from receipts kept for the right reasons and ramps fixed without applause and first aid kits in every vehicle and an old man on a stoop making her mother laugh. She had learned it from being asked the right people. From being herself, the right answer to questions someone needed to ask. Sat in the back row of Tank's session in a folding chair that was slightly too small for him, with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, listening to his friend talk. He would stay for the whole session. He would stay afterward to help stack the chairs. Drive home on his motorcycle in the June afternoon and not tell anyone what the session had been like, because he did not need to tell anyone he had been there. That was sufficient. And the world did not require his commentary on things that had spoken for themselves. He was not a man who needed to be called a hero. He was a man who showed up. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. And Emily Parker had spent the better part of her life in rooms where nobody understood that difference, that finally permanently, genuinely, without conditions, by people who lived it every single day without being asked. She leaned against the back wall of the room she had built with her grandmother's money and her own 2 years of fear, and 6 weeks of something better than fear, and she listened to Tank talk about the in-between, and she did not count the seconds because she did not need to anymore, because she was not waiting for anything. She had already found it, and it had started all of it. Every last irreversible piece of it with a woman who ran out of options on a rainy Tuesday morning and decided, against 23 years of careful self-erasure, to ask. That asking was the bravest thing Emily Parker ever did, and it brought her everything.